In this video I'm going to make some dog beds to use up some oak veneered MDF offcuts left over from the radio station studio desks commission that I did a few months back. A lot of dog beds which are available to buy tend to look a bit cheap and nasty, so really I want to make something that looks more like a piece of furniture, something that will look good in someone's home. And I wanted to design something with a mid-century modern feel to it, mainly because that's the style of furniture that I like personally. So I did some basic 3D drawings in SketchUp that allowed me to not only better visualize what the beds would look like, but also to help figure out how many of the beds I could make from the MDF pieces that I had available to work with. I began by ripping the panels to the right width using the table saw. And I made a few cross cuts with my circular saw using a straight edge as a fence. I'm not cutting these pieces to their final length, I'm just dividing up the pieces to be more manageable in size. I decided to use mitre joints for the bed, mainly because the 45-degree cuts would hide the MDF innards of the sheet material. I tilted my table saw blade to 45 degrees and used my panel sled on the table saw to cut one end of each of the panels. I then realised that these panels were narrow enough to cut on the mitre saw, so after measuring and marking up each panel based on the dimensions from my drawing, I made the rest of the cuts on the mitre saw. That way I could set up a stop block so that all of the cuts of the same length would be consistent. After cutting the short sides of the box, I then marked up, set up a stop block and made the cuts for the longer sides of the box. Unfortunately, I lost some video footage at this point in the project, so I'm going to try and reconstruct what I did next as convincingly as possible without actually having to redo it. Luckily, I've got a spare panel here that I decided not to use because it got damaged when it fell off the workbench, so I'll use that to demonstrate. First, I needed to cut these housing joints to accommodate a bottom panel on all four sides of the box. I made those cuts at the table saw just by making a series of cuts and moving the fence each time to form the joint. I could check that I got the sizing right for the housing joint just by using another piece of the same material. And I made each cut to all of the panels before moving the fence in between cuts to keep both the placement of the joint and the width of the joint consistent across all of the panels. Next, I positioned all four panels of the box together and measured the distance between the inside of the housing joints on the opposing panels, and that gave me the dimensions that I would need to use for the bottom panel. Before actually cutting the bottom panels though, I took a couple of millimeters off each of those dimensions just to make the glue up assembly easier. Then I cut the bottom panels to those dimensions on the table saw, and then I could mark up the shape that I wanted the side panels to be. So if you imagine that this panel is currently this shape, I first measured up 195 millimeters from the back, and then I could offer up the front panel and mark up the height of that. Then I measured in 19 millimeters from the front, which is the thickness of the material that I'm working with, and I marked up a straight line here and this diagonal line here. And then I could cut out the shape of the side panels using the bandsaw. Next, it was time to assemble, and fortunately I have the video footage for that, so back to the video. I added some wood glue and then fitted the bottom panel into the housing joint on one of the side panels, making sure that the bottom panel was centered to the side panel so that it would fit inside where the housing joint meets the mitre joint, if that makes sense. And then I could add the opposite panel in the same way. Then I applied glue to the mitre joints and the housing joint for the back panel and added that too. I made sure it was properly seated with my mallet, and then I added the front panel in the same way. I used ratchet straps to clamp up the four panels to get nice tight glue joints. and I wiped away any excess glue with a damp cloth. These miter joints would not be very strong, so I'd use dowels to reinforce them. I drilled some holes with a 10mm brad point bit, and I added a piece of masking tape to the drill bit to make sure that I was drilling the holes to the right depth. Then I added glue and knocked the dowels in place. I cut the dowels off flush using my Japanese pull saw. I had some offcuts of sapele, and I'd use these to make some trim pieces to hide the MDF edges. I thought that this dark wood would contrast nicely against the oak. I applied glue and added the trim using some brad nails before cutting it to length. The trim pieces for the diagonal parts of the side panel needed to be cut at the right angle to marry up to the next piece of trim, so I marked it up with a pencil and then cut that angle. Before adding these pieces, I just did a little clean-up work with a block plane to make sure that my bandsaw cuts were good and straight. I did a bit of hand sanding just to soften any sharp edges, and I used some oak filler to fill any small gaps in between the trim and the panels. I did the rest of the sanding with my random orbit sander, and for the regular viewers wondering why I'm using the Bosch sander here, it's because this video was filmed a few weeks ago while I still had it, and it went back to Amazon, so I no longer have it. I'm going to make some legs for the dog beds using these pieces of wood that came from an old hat and coat stand, and I salvaged a bunch of these some time ago, and these are already a pretty good shape to form the legs, so I can just cut them to length and then clean them up. I removed the rubber feet from the bottom which were screwed on, and then I set up a stop block at the miter saw to cut all the legs to a consistent length. I used my hand plane to clean off the old finish from these pieces. Some of the legs were a different type of wood and didn't plane too well, so I used a scraper on those instead. And this wood is going to cause me some more issues later on in this project, which you'll see shortly. It's some sort of extremely dense hardwood. I decided to cut a new taper to each leg so that they'd all be a consistent shape, and I first thought to use my table saw with my tapering jig for this. However, as I was making the first cut, it really didn't feel safe enough because these pieces were quite short, and as I was cutting, the force of the blade was pulling the tapering jig away from the table saw fence. And if something doesn't feel right, it usually means it isn't right, so I abandoned that idea and instead measured and marked up a taper onto each leg with a pencil and made the cuts on the bandsaw instead, which worked fine. And I cleaned up those bandsaw blade cuts with my hand plane. I also put a slight bevel on the edges of the legs using my block plane, just to soften the edges. Then I could glue the legs in place onto the bottom of the bed. I held them in position with some F-clamps so that I could flip the bed over, and then I could drill some pilot holes through the bottom of the beds and into the legs, and add some screws. So I mentioned earlier that one set of the legs was a very dense hardwood, and this is where I had some issues. I think what was happening is that these screws were getting so hot when being driven into this dense hardwood that it caused some of them to break. And these are good quality screws too, they're quite expensive, and I got a bunch of these given to me a while back by my uncle, so I was quite surprised that it happened to these. To fix this, I first needed to cut off the protruding screw using my angle grinder. And the corner of the bed was a bit too tight to get in there properly, so I came back with my power belt file to grind the top of the screw flush with the bottom panel. And then I drilled a wider pilot hole right next to the first hole, and drove in another screw as gently as I could, but unfortunately I still had a couple of them break on me. I made 3 of these dog beds in total, and it was only one of the beds that I had this issue with. The legs on the other 2 beds were just fine. So for this one I used some of these metal angle plates to reinforce the legs from underneath. And then, just for a bit of extra reassurance, I also mixed up some epoxy and added that to fill any gaps between the legs and the bed frame, and then I was confident that these legs would be good and strong. I used some sandpaper to break any hard edges on the bottom of the legs. This should avoid any possibility of tear out to the wood when the beds get dragged around. To finish the beds I decided to use some mineral oil. I mainly chose this because it seemed like the most pet-friendly finish that I had. For the cushions I'd use these. I bought these from Amazon for around £11, and when I designed my beds I sized the beds so that these cushions would fit snugly inside. I did think about making cushions for the bed, but it would have cost me far more in materials and time than just buying these ones ready-made. Plus, these cushions have the added bonus of a zip, which makes the covers easy to remove and wash. And they're super soft too. The only downside of these, in my opinion, is that they have a bit of branding in one corner. Before I even had a chance to finish all 3 of the beds, I walked into my dining room to find that one of them had already attracted a rogue squatter. Dylan, it's a dog bed. It's not a cat bed, is it? So that's the dog beds project finished, and I'm really pleased with how they look, but there's one problem, and that's the weight of them. The 19mm thick oak veneered MDF material that I used for this project is really quite heavy, and when the beds were fully assembled I knew that postage or shipping costs were going to be really expensive. In hindsight, I could have perhaps used something like a 12mm plywood, which would have been lighter for the bottom panel of the beds, but even so I still think the weight of the beds would be an issue. I have put the beds up for sale on my Etsy store anyway, with a ludicrously high postage cost, in the hope that someone might like them enough to pay for it. But ultimately I suspect I'm going to have to try and sell them locally, that way I can deliver them myself. So this one wasn't a massively successful project, but at least I've got rid of all of those spare bits of MDF that were getting in the way in the workshop. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and please subscribe if you haven't already.